So this is a feast day of light and wind and energy. And I arrived early this morning before 7, and I booted up the computer to print my sermon, and the system was rebooting. And the connection for our network was down, and so I preached this morning from a laptop with a touch screen that God provided through the Spirit. But I came into the sanctuary and I threw the lights on, and we lost one of the lights right above the altar. It blew out with a pop. The Spirit is here. I'm not sure what she's up to today, but she's here in this house. On this, the 50th day of Easter, when we celebrate the Spirit through whom and in whom the people of God are created and recreated. Now, Pentecost is sometimes called the church's birthday. I'm not so sure I like that phrase. I think of it more as the church's baptism day, because the gift of the Spirit is the fullness of baptism. And Paul, in our Romans reading, makes it clear that God is in the process of recreating the entire cosmos. And yet the Spirit of God is also at work in the most intimate and personal of ways, praying and breathing in and through each one of us. Praying in weeks when we as a nation grieve yet another school shooting. Praying in and through us when we as a faith community gathered with the Sundquist family yesterday to commend Amy to God's eternal and mighty keeping. We as Spirit-filled people gather and grieve. We worry and we wonder. And the Holy Spirit of God intercedes for us, praying with sighs too deep for words when there just are no words, when the breath gets caught in our throat, when we do not know how to pray. German Reformed theologian Jürgen Moltmann, known for his understanding of God through the lens of hope, says that to experience this fellowship of the Spirit ultimately carries Christianity beyond itself into the greater fellowship of God's creatures, for the community of creation, in which all created things exist with one another, for one another, and in one another. It is also the fellowship of the Holy Spirit, breathing in and through all created beings, all created things. These experiences of the Spirit bring the church today into solidarity with all created being, with the entire cosmos, which is so mortally threatened this day. Now, in earlier times, contempt for life, hostility towards the body, and detachment from this world was merely an inward attitude of mind. And now it has become an everyday practice, a reality in the cynicism of the progressive destruction of nature. Discovery of the cosmic breath of God's Spirit in and through all things leads in the opposite direction of the world's ways. And it respects the dignity of every created thing. Respect in which God is present through the Holy Spirit, through the very breath and lifeblood of all creation. Respect in which God continues to show God's self in the wind, in the beating of a heart, in the creative mind of human beings. In the present situation, this discovery of the Spirit is not romantic poetry or speculative vision. It is the essential premise of the survival of all of humanity here on God's creation. The uniqueness of every created being, of every person, of every plant, of every speck of creation, spinning together in this earthly place. So Pentecost is this gift of the Spirit of God to all of creation. It is beyond our ability to fully fathom and wrap our arms around. It is the bold proclamation that God is everywhere and in everything, and that our responsibility is to be light and love. A responsibility that is expansive, beyond our ability, and extending to every corner and creature. It means that God doesn't box God's people in church walls, but sends us out. Sends us out to places so that the church can become incarnate, breathing the creating, saving, and sustaining life and love of God throughout all of creation. It proclaims that in the presence of God's Spirit, we are moved outward, beyond ourselves in such a way that we begin to see and to know and to feel that all things are filled with the dignity of God's holy touch and holy truth. All God's creation matters. It all counts. And at the end, nothing will be lost. And that is the good news of Jesus the Christ. That's the story and the gift of the Holy Spirit poured out, breathed into, and unleashed on this Pentecost day. Beloveds, without Pentecost, we are just people who tell Jesus' story. With the power of the Holy Spirit in and through our very beings, we are Pentecost people who live into Jesus' story. At Pentecost, that Spirit is poured out upon the entire community of believers we hear in Acts. Just as Jesus and the prophets and scriptures had foretold. Empowered by the Spirit, the entire community bears witness to God's activity in the world. God's activity in the full diversity of all cultures and all languages. But we don't do diversity well. We like our worlds neat and tidy. We like folks to speak our language, to be able to feel a connection culturally, and even on beautiful green lawns. As bright yellow dandelions are popping up, we are plotting. With Roundup in hand or a rotary spreader to make that corner of God's creation that we control perfect. We fail to see the beauty in the diversity of all creation. In the black fly that you swatted away this morning. In the cranky person you may have encountered. You see, there is beauty and complexity in this cosmos God has created. And even though we have limited and often selfish worldviews, we struggle with this Holy Spirit that moves us outside of ourselves and our churches. Now, I hate to quote anything I read on the internet. Some days I even hate to look at the internet. But this week, the internet reflected perfectly this idea of diversity and our struggle with it, and our own limited, myopic worldview. You see, on Tuesday, rabid disagreement came up over an audio clip. You may have played along with this. There was a clip of someone reading a phrase, a word, in which there was a name said. And the disagreement is over what was the name said. Now, you might remember a couple of years ago there was a dress online, and was it tan or gold or blue? Or it's the same kind of a thing. It depends on the listener, you see. Some people heard Laurel, while others heard Yanny. Now, a few lucky folks heard a little bit of both. But the whole Laurel and Yanny thing is not the end of the world. But it fascinated me this week in light of our text and the complexities of our limited view of how things should be and how things are. how myopic we as human beings can be. Because we as people insist that our experience is the right one. What we heard is what everyone must be hearing. You see, that is the correct experience. And that anything that was heard differently from our own, well, you're just not hearing it right. You're just not seeing things the way you should be seeing. Think about how often we discount the experience of others because it is so different than our own experience. What would our world be like if we lived as Pentecost people? With a willingness to understand that we might hear things differently, but at the core, we are children of God, beloveds. What would it be like if we simply lived into the Jesus story, valuing others regardless of their experience, what they hear or what they see? You see, the reality of this Yanny Laurel controversy is that both names are being played at the exact same time. My understanding from reading a little bit of technical stuff on this is that Yanny is being said in a tenor-like octave, while Laurel is being said in a bass-like octave. It's beyond my pay scale and my musical ability. But our brain hears these two words said at the same time, and it picks out one. And so we think it is the only one to be heard or experienced. And so much of our daily living and our world today is black and white, blue or red, this or that. And beloveds, our world is actually a this and that kind of a world. Both are right, simply because both are experienced by children of God. And we don't need to experience everyone else's life for our lives to not all be right, for us all to experience the Holy Spirit in vastly different ways. Some churches even raise their hands when they sing and pray. One just needs to respect our neighbor's experience as authentic, even if it's something we have never tried or experienced or seen or heard. And to remember that God declares, "I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy and see visions and dream dreams. Even upon my slaves, both men and women. In those days I will pour out my Spirit, and they shall prophesy." They shall prophesy. Yesterday, the world saw a descendant of African American slaves proclaim the gospel to descendants of his ancestors and slavers. I believe that we saw a glimpse of the power of the Spirit's redemptive and recreating work in the world. During his royal wedding address, our presiding bishop quoted the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said we must discover the power of love, the redemptive power of love, and when we do that, we will make this old world a new world. Love is the only way. There's power in love. Don't overestimate it. Don't even over-sentimentalize it. There's power in love. Beloveds, we are called. We have the Holy Spirit poured into us to be more than people who just tell Jesus' story. The Spirit breathes in and urges us to go outside of ourselves throughout our lives, igniting us to be Pentecost people who live into and share the story of Jesus the Christ, which is the power of love. Part of that story sends us towards new creation together in the life and the love of the Spirit, together living into and sharing Jesus' respect for the dignity of all created things, just as God intended. We are Pentecost people. And when we walk together, when we see the spark and fan the flames in one another. That's when full peace is possible. That's when redemption happens. And that, beloveds, is when the power of love wins.